Okay, so GDPR, you guys are probably familiar with it, and the reason that I wanted to talk about it is, obviously this is from Europe, and it is changing the way that data is regulated and how data usage is regulated. Um, I guess let me just take a step back to sort of reg tech, if you will. It used to be regulate. If you wanted to have any, the banks were really close with the regulators, and coming from a bank, the argument was always, we're a big bank, we know what's going on, so you should trust us. And then the financial crisis happened, and then there was a realization that, maybe not, the banks didn't know everything that they said that they knew. And so I think that opened up a lot of questions about what should we regulate and how should we regulate it. And so I guess a few things I wanted to call out with GDPR is, it's even if you're not based in Europe, but if you have European customers, you're still you still need to abide by these regulations. There's sort of consent, the explicit consent that needs to happen in terms of getting consent from consumers about how you're using their data and when you're using it. There's also the idea of portability. And I think that portability is, like the concept has been more alive in Europe than in the States, but I think it's also going to be coming to the States as well too. But like, so for example, in the UK, probably about, I think it was like somewhere 7 to 10 years ago, there was a regulation about how consumers should be able to get their bank records and take that to another bank, and then use that for helping a bank to price better, perhaps, their services. And what happened with that was, the consumers would get their data, and there was really it wasn't digital; it was paper, and so the consumers would edit that data, would omit data, and so what ended up happening is that the banks on the receiving end couldn't necessarily trust that data. But I think with GDPR, what they're trying to get is still that portability without sacrificing the sense of, the sense of not fraud, I guess. Then there's also the right to be forgotten. Consumers can take their data off, this is something, for example, that with Google and so forth, that they've sort of had issues with that as well, and privacy by design, I think that the way that the bureaus initially started was that you had these sources of alternate data that was talked about in the last panel, and it was actually kept hidden from the consumer. And so the consumer was intentionally omitted from that process. And now I think we're sort of evolved to a point where it's very consumer-centric. And so that, once again, that really needs to be taken into account. This is another snapshot, a graphic of GDPR, and I just wanted to call out sort of the lower left corner of like the rights of data subjects, transparency, automated decision making, access, right to erasure, and so once again, these are, if you're coming from the traditional credit bureau world, it's pretty radical. It's not something that has been front and center, but because of GDPR, once again in Europe, it has been taken there. I guess one more thing that with GDPR, there's also the question of who is the who's the regulator that's administering it. So, for example, Ireland, that they Ireland has, like for example, Facebook, Google, actually a lot of sort of the digital upstarts, or not, they're not upstarts. They're the biggest companies now, but they're based in Ireland, and so they're part of the Irish economy and a big part of it, and so there's maybe a little bit of like question of like how hard do they want to regulate this part of the economy that is a major part of the economy, whereas someplace like France or Germany, they might be a little bit more active, and so that's just another thing I wanted to call out. But and then why this is relevant is that whenever you see regulation that's sort of consumer friendly or trying to put some bounds around a new industry, a lot of times that winds up being the starting point for new legislation. So, like back in 2002, I was at Citi and I was looking at prepaid cards and trying to help Citi cards figure out, okay, how do we launch a prepaid card? And back then the regulatory regimes were not well defined, and so what I wound up doing is that especially at the federal level, and getting in Congress to do anything is obviously quite difficult, and then lining up all of those various regulators to do something is even more difficult. So, but there's more stuff happening at the state level, and so I started to look at some of the state regulations and tried to line up. Okay, this is what's happening in California. This is what's happening in Massachusetts, and almost like making a lowest common denominator of this is what we can do and be okay with pretty much most of the states, and so I sort of see and when, for example, federal regulation did get enacted at the in the states, a lot of that prior legislation was in fact used. So I think it's even though GDPR might not seem relevant to you, I do think that you should at least think about it and try to, especially if you're trying to plan ahead, because more likely than not, there's going to be some flavor of that probably on the horizon. And so, for example, there's the California Consumer Privacy Act, which is actually, people have been talking about it in terms of like the US's version of GDPR. There are some slight differences. Like, for example, like households are protected in California, but they're not necessarily protected in, it's only individuals in GDPR. And then covered entities in California, they've defined it in terms of businesses, whereas in GDPR, it can be any entity that has access to the data. So it's much more broad. And in California, so for example, there's even, if you're smaller than this size, you don't have to worry about this. Or if you're, there's a lot of things that you can sort of, takes you out of the running. And I can go a little bit more into it or not, if that's of interest. But like I said, it's something to be mindful of.
Real quick, what does CCPA stand for?
Yeah, the California Consumer Privacy Act. And actually another one that was passed recently, Vermont had a data brokers bill passed. I can't remember what it's called, but if you are selling data about any individuals in Vermont, you need to register with the state, and you need to abide by certain minimum privacy, security, basically security levels and so forth. And so I think that only started in December of last year. So in a few months, I think they've already had, 127 data brokers already sign up in Vermont. So once again, it sort of gives you a sense of that scope. And talking about security, it's obviously very much front and center. It's as businesses and consumers realize the importance of their data, and how exposed they are, they just it's become more front and center. And let's see. There's many different things here, but I think one of the things that I wanted to call out is like even the and we're doing it with Guppy, and even like sort of the existing bureaus are doing it as well too. But like sort of keeping track of what data has been bought and sold on the dark web. That type of information is out there, and it's probably not used as much as it can be, especially if you're thinking about a banking experience. Banking experiences used to be much more brick and mortar, but for the most part, they're very digital heavy now. And when you have a digital heavy experience versus a brick and mortar experience, the identification methods are completely different. And so if you're not looking at that information, I think that's sort of not necessarily the smartest thing. Then as far as like the APIs for businesses, for me this was like, for example, once again when we were building Money 2020, like for example when Stripe came out, that was actually quite transformative for me, having been in the payments industry for 10 plus years at that time, and being drilled that payments is impossible. You need like a black box. You need this and that. You're never going to make it simple. And then the Collison brothers, they made the Stripe API, and that really shook my mind as far as and changed my self-perception of what I was working on. And I think that like even if you look out beyond Stripe to, for example, mobile point of sale, once again there used to be those used to be black box systems where it was walled gardens and you had very tight controls of what was in and out. But with mobile point of sale, then you sort of changed the mindset to more like the Apple App Store, and you had different apps that could be used at point of sale. And so I think that the way that retailers in sort of the mobile point of sale perspective, or direct-to-consumer retailers in the point of Stripe, it was like, okay, how do I make changes very quickly? How do I add features really quickly? How can I adapt to change very quickly, as opposed to having something that became much more of an issue. And so I think that's and this graphic is from 2017, so it's a couple years old, but it just sort of shows you the number of APIs that are out there, and by category, and at that point I think there was like 17,000 APIs, and even when we were building Guppy, we want to have API. That was pretty much the only way that we were going to connect with data sources, and looking at the breadth of data, the depth of data, as well as the quality of data was critical, and actually, which is why we integrated with UrgentNet, and like later on, I've got my UrgentNet, I've got my utility data from UrgentNet on the Guppy blockchain. I can show it to you on my phone and stuff like that later. I get a kick out of it, but maybe you might not. But then sort of the open systems. I don't know if you guys have read Jeff Bezos's letter this year, and he talked about how more than 50% of Amazon sales was not from Amazon, but from retailers that connected into Amazon. And what is Amazon's core business? They're a retailer, but they opened up and they're letting sort of their competitors in because it's better for the consumer. And I think that that's the type of mindset that we're trying to build Guppy with, is like, okay, what is best for consumer might not necessarily be best for us, but like, how do we make it as consumer friendly an experience as we can, and still serve the needs of the ecosystem. And so obviously consumers have, this was from BCG, but it was like, how customers want to interact with their banks. So 37% said it's something like Amazon, 29% said personal shopper, and then supermarket, doctor, but basically the top two involves personalization. It involves data about that consumer. So consumers want they want that data to be used, but they're also worried about it, and because of security and so forth. So that's sort of the fine balance, I'd say. Another piece about transparency. We've built Guppy on blockchain, and one of the big benefits of blockchain is transparency. And people will ask us, okay, so what's the point of transparency? But like I just wanted to show that this is, if you order something on Amazon, and it's giving you a very granular level of insight into what's happening at the logistics. So for example, on the right, it should be arriving by 9 p.m. The driver is making 9 deliveries before yours. It's updated 10 seconds ago. If you thought about that maybe 10, 15 years ago, like why would you ever want that? If you asked you would not think about that. But it's actually something that consumers really get interested in. And once again, I think there's a comment about Prime. Like you want to see that it's getting there as fast as possible. This is sort of the convenience piece of it. So you have the Blockbuster video tape, then you have Netflix with their mail-in DVDs, and then you have the Netflix app, and so things are getting more convenient. But actually, like just sort of a corollary to this is that maybe you've heard about the Disney Plus service that's going to be launched. Then Warner Brothers. You have these other media companies that are likely going to be taking their content off of Netflix, and so then that sort of makes you think, okay, well, part of the value of Netflix is that it personalizes based off of your data, and so then I was just sort of thinking, like, so what about even like travel? You have like Orbitz, Expedia, and so forth, but then you have like Kayak. Then you've got the sort of the ones that sort of take data from all from all the others. So by doing that, will that open up an opportunity for sort of almost like something that manages your media subscriptions? And this is like a little bit out there, but like I've always thought about like luxury algorithms. We think of algorithms as being very utilitarian, but if I have an algorithm that's helps, it becomes a luxury good. And then can you create something that you can charge a premium for because of an algorithm? So I maybe a little bit too crazy out there, but then let's talk a little bit about some technology trends also. So when we started Money 2020, I think that one of the big trends back then was mobility, the smartphone, and so Jack Dorsey had just created the Square dongle like a year or two before, and then Google Wallet and other types of things like that, and so you had the persistently connected consumer, and then that also opened up marketplaces. Can I grab?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry. You had sort of the marketplaces like Uber, Airbnb, and then like I said, you had more open systems and APIs, and then I'd say that was sort of I'd say the beginning of Money 2020. Those are some of the trends that really were things that people were really interested in, and what we capitalized on and talked about and put on the agenda. I'd say more recently, stuff like AI, blockchain, and even like cloud and IoT kind of stuff. I mean, I think that's sort of been more top of mind more recently, and I'm happy to talk about any of these types of things. So, for example, so I actually like, and I've like with AI, like this back in '93, I used to do research in using artificial neural networks to detect arrhythmia, and got published in an IEEE conference and so forth. And it was very science fiction, but now the computing power has gotten to the point where you can in fact do this on Fairly, fairly regularly, and a lot of I guess like even like doing it on a self-organized basis. With Bitcoin and blockchain, there's a lot going on there. So I think that one thing that you know, if you're thinking about blockchain, I think you need like three major things. You need a multi-party situation, because if it's just like one or two parties, you don't really, there's really not much value in blockchain. You also need these parties to be at a arm's length distance, because if they are very close, then you could just do it on a regular database. And then finally, there has to be sort of a group consensus that that the accuracy of the data is of tantamount importance, and it's like critical. And if you have all of those three things, then it's at least worth thinking about blockchain. And another sort of rule of three that about blockchain I'll throw out there is that that there's decentralization, security, and speed. Pick two of the three. And so that is so for example, like Ethereum is the main Ethereum network is relatively decentralized, but there's been some speed issues with it. But it's still relatively secure, and so that's why when we looked at Guppy, for example, we've built it on a private permissioned blockchain, and so we've taken away some of the decentralization, but it's still transparent, and the benefits are that it's fast, and that it's still secure. So I mean that, like with if you're a technologist, you know that there's always trade-offs, and those are some of the trade-offs that I wanted to call out. Yeah. Yeah, so I think that the AI that I've heard a lot about it being used in like fraud detection, and there's some used for like offers and so forth. But I think a lot of times the problem with AI tends to be you need to be able to explain it to the regulators. And that's why if you're doing something with fraud, you can probably, I think you have a little bit more leeway. But if you're looking at it as a way to determine who to give or not to give services, I think that raises probably a little bit higher flags. I think there's also I've also heard about AI being used in like back-end processes. So for example, actually, one of my co-founders of Guppy, he's background is Watson, and so for example, feeding Watson a regulation, and then having Watson go through that and like spit out, okay, these are the actual actionable things, and these are so like just making some of that work process a little bit smoother. That probably not as sexy, but that needs to happen. Oh, okay. Okay, so this is a really right now. I guess I didn't get a chance to talk about Guppy too much. I was talking about the industry a lot, but I hope that was more interesting for you guys. But we're like I said, we're built on a blockchain. It's self-sovereign and scalable and monetizable and transparent. And the idea is that you as a consumer, or even as a bank that has the account with the consumer, should be able to verify and monetize that data, and try to have something that's basically a more consumer-friendly solution. This is I'm not going to have time to go through this, but basically, also with smart contracts, we've got a great degree of granularity as far as like how you can use it. So say, for example, you've got 4 furnishers, you've got different customers. A customer can say, I only want to make my data available for credit cards or mortgages, or I only want to make my data available to banks or to everyone. And furnishers can also restrict the usage of their data so that it's, for example, only for identity verification. So it's this is with the traditional bureau system. Once the bureaus have the data providers lose control over it. And with Guppy, like once you give us the data, that's just the beginning. You control it. This is your data. We're the custodians of it, and we will algorithmically control how it gets used. But that's it. So I hope this was somewhat interesting.
Yeah, right. Thank you.
Okay.
We do have just a couple minutes for Q&A, and I'll lead things off by asking you a question.
Yeah.
What has been so you're creating a distributed ledger for consumer credit data.
Mm-hmm.
What has been the response from the big bureaus? How do they react to what you're doing? What has their response been?
So the one funny story I'll share is that last year I met someone who's EVP of ventures of one of the large bureaus, and I saw him speak, and afterwards I went to introduce myself to him, and I introduced myself as the former CM of Money 2020, and he basically yawned, and then I gave him my card, my Guppy card, and then his eyes lit up. He smiled. He's like, "Guppy, you're on my board at the office," and I was like, "What do you mean? We're like 3 people?" and here I was talking about Money 2020. So I think that I've actually, so even when I wrote a LinkedIn post about Guppy back in 2017, October 2017, shortly after the Equifax hack, and within 4 months, 3 of the top 10 banks reached out to me proactively. One of the large payment networks reached out to me proactively, and to me that told me that actually, even though I had experienced some data pain points while at Citi, that the pain points might actually be worse, and so there might even be a greater opportunity for Guppy.
That's fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
We do need to wrap up and get to the main session. I will tell you that I have seen a demo of the app on his phone. I have seen his utility data on the blockchain on his phone, including the misspelled name that the utility provided to him. Yeah. So it's all there if you want to see it. Thanks again, Sanjib. That's a fantastic presentation.
Thank you.